So hello and thank you for joining us for our April episode of the Housing Solutions Speaker Series, which exists to highlight the variety of housing research and practice and their connections to health and health equity. My name is Roshanak Medipana and I'm the director of this initiative. For those unfamiliar with what we do, the Housing Solutions for Health Equity Initiative informs local, state, and national policy through interdisciplinary research on housing as it relates to equity in health, race, socioeconomic status, and aging. I'm very excited for our event today, where we will hear about how we can use eviction data to inform city policy in Michigan. We will hear from one of our faculty experts at the Housing Solutions for Health Equity, who's also a professor of urban planning at Michigan's Taubman College, Rob Goodspeed, as well as April Faith-Slaker, who directs the Department of Eviction Defense at the City of Detroit. Throughout the event, feel free to submit your questions to the Zoom Q&A, and we hope to answer them during the Q&A session at the end. But first, I have the pleasure of introducing Libby Benton, who will moderate the event. Libby Benton is the Associate Counsel to National Initiatives at the Center for Community Progress, where she helps communities develop equitable, efficient, and effective strategies to address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties. Prior to joining Community Progress, she represented tenants and low-income homeowners as a legal aid attorney in Massachusetts and Michigan. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you, Roshanak, and thank you all for joining us today. As someone who used to defend tenants from eviction and now helps local governments use data to address housing challenges, I'm incredibly excited about today's panel. The panel couldn't be more timely as eviction filing rates across the state are rising to pre-pandemic level at the same time that pandemic era funding and protections are expiring. I'm going to start by introducing our first panelist, Rob Goodspeed. Rob is an associate professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. He teaches and conducts research in the areas of urban informatics, equitable housing, and scenario planning, and is the author of the book Scenario Planning for Cities and Regions, Managing and Envisioning Uncertain Futures. Rob?
Great, thank you very much, Libby. And how's that look? Great, thank you to Roshanak for the invitation and to Jameson for organizing this event so clearly. I'll want to provide a kind of brief introduction of some of the work that I've been involved in. So I'm speaking today really as the faculty participant and a representative of a collaborative research project called Michigan Evictions, which, as you'll learn, Libby participated in as well, along with other practitioners and Margie Dewar and emerita faculty from our program. And so we're really, I want to talk on just three things, and then really excited to hear from April and have a collaborative discussion about where we might go next. First, I'll just very briefly introduce the topic of evictions and eviction data. That will answer the question, how did I get involved in this work? Next, I described there's this collaborative project, so I'm going to describe what data is out there and briefly touch on some of the products that our project produced in the last several years, and that will help build our kind of understanding of the resources that exist in the state. And then finally, I have some more speculative thoughts about what could be done with eviction data to feed into the conversation we're going to have. And so maybe one starting point for this is work done by the pioneering sociologist Matthew Desmond, who wrote this renowned book, Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, based on ethnographic research in the city of Milwaukee. And eviction was known. In fact, there's a great 2003 article by a radical planning scholar named Chester Hartman describing evictions as the hidden housing problem, calling for the creation of a national database of evictions. So it's well known in legal aid and some housing circles, but Matthew's book and research placed it on the national agenda. And after publishing the book, he created something called the Eviction Lab at Princeton, and they created a national map for the first time, answering the call of Chester Hartman. And here's what it looked like in 2018 data. I think the really impressive thing to Matthew Desmond, not only authoring that book, has really authored a series of quantitative social science research papers, which has inspired others and complemented work done by others and pre-existing community-based research initiatives like the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project in San Francisco, which has accumulated a body of social science evidence that has, I think, resulted in evictions being reframed for many from a simple symptom of poverty to actually a cause of poverty and social problems. And so these just provide some of the references. Citations are in our reports. So this kind of, the case for evictions as a health and health equity issue. Speaking to equity, there's a growing body of research based on painstaking field research because that's what's required to capture data about identity, looking at who experiences evictions from an equity lens and finding that it is people of color, women, families with children, domestic violence survivors, among others. So this research, I think, has further motivated a policy interest from an equity perspective in addressing eviction because we know it's going to disproportionately affect certain populations. So this is the social science introduction. Prior to this project, the word eviction didn't appear on my CV. So what am I doing talking about this? And it really starts with this map. So in summer of 2018, the maps launched, and Libby, who at the time was working as a legal aid attorney, had been following Matthew Desmond's work along with her colleagues for many years, pulled it up, and she knew me. She knew that I was a data person, and she looked at the map and said, well, what this shows is that there was no data available for Washtenaw County. And that's the county that their office represented tenants. And furthermore, in the legal aid community, the rumblings were the data seemed really off for the rest of the state. And the simple question Libby asked me was why? And it prompted me to read their methodology document in detail and discover that the data they had from Michigan, they knew to be deeply flawed, and they knew to only contain about 2/3 of the eviction cases here. And there are many years and geographies where the data were either suspect or missing entirely. So it's once a data person hears about data problems, they look for data. And so we investigated and we learned that the state has something known as the State Judicial Data Warehouse. And Libby and I drove to Lansing. The only photo I took that day, I wish you took like a selfie, but anyway, from the Hall of Justice, grandiose neoclassical edifice overlooking the state capitol, but it's Michigan, so you got a big parking lot too. And we met with Laura Hutzel, who's the staff member at the State Court Administrative Office, and part of her job is managing this database. And she explained that it was available for research. You have to go through a formal approval process, there's a governing board. It's not considered a public record, but that it did contain civil cases, including evictions, and might be of interest to us. So long story short, Libby and I assembled our group, applied for and received funding from Poverty Solutions to conduct a project to obtain data about evictions and really do what has become a genre. There are dozens around the country of you start with a benchmarking report that shows what's going on with the evictions in your geography. Most of these are done for cities or regions, but we would do a statewide project. And And so we discovered, our project kind of combined multiple data sources. So the key one was this judicial data warehouse. And it's created by automated uploading of data from all of the local district courts around the states, limited information. And court cases aren't electronic. What the electronic part of court cases in Michigan district courts, court case is an accumulation of paper documents. There's no e-filing. And certain information from each case is entered into computer systems by court staff. And so these computer systems have, in theory, the courts can run reports and share it directly with you. And we tried doing that. It wasn't super fruitful for various reasons, not by lack of willingness, but really the systems didn't seem to be well set up to provide reports. But then the similar data are extracted and by the state office and put into the statewide database. But we had research questions that weren't limited to what we could learn from those databases. And the most crucial one is you get a lot of data about the case, but actually at that time, the data about the disposition, the outcome of the case was there actually an order of eviction was not being consistently collected and placed into the warehouse. That's actually changed. And so for that reason, but even today, the warehouse doesn't contain facts like how much back rent was owed, other things like that that you can get by flipping through paper files. So to learn that, we took a random sample of 400 cases and visited 4 district courts in the region and flipped through and created data in a spreadsheet database with research assistants to answer those questions. I saw there's a question coming through. Really, the problem with the eviction lab map was its incompleteness for Michigan. That's so to be precise. It's not that there's wrong data. There's some data there, but we discovered that it's great. Really, we're able to analyze rigorously how and why it's incomplete. And the part of the first report, there's an appendix where I go county by county and show you. You can zoom in if you care to know, but our strategy has been actually just to move beyond that and advise folks to use our data and products and not theirs for Michigan. But even what they're doing has shifted. Okay, so it's a collaborative project. So here are the names. Is Jim Shasma from the Michigan Poverty Law Program, which is affiliated with the Legal Services Organization Libby worked for, and Margie. Our first report was this more descriptive thing. As we were doing the final editing, the pandemic hit and evictions went from kind of somewhat growing hot topic to a major focus of policymakers' attention for obvious reasons. And, we found what we found confirmed what the legal aid community feared was that eviction filing rates were very high in Michigan, especially in metropolitan areas and communities of color. So I'm just kind of zoomed through this kind of a consistent high level statewide. There's a concern in certain markets like Detroit. There are more extensive use of land contracts. And so those don't appear as eviction cases. They appear as what in the data as summary proceedings cases. So we found from a statewide perspective, those are pretty small. So that they may be significant in certain places, but that we did have data and could look into that. We also prepared a policy brief talking about different policy ideas related to eviction. We were very expansive and optimistic and meaning the kind of, but the one thing I highlight here is, we publish it, the pandemic hits, and lots of different ideas here influence or were actually implemented. And it's not that it wouldn't have happened without us, because we were, of course, compiling best practices from around the country and the ideas that were circulating. But for example, to fund and create eviction diversion programs, some version of that was done by the Whitmer administration in the summer of 2020 in every court. From a data point of view, we have a track level map, and then we have various GIS maps that are in the report, as well as rankings of different cities and so forth. Just want to touch on, so this is what we produce from the state database. And yeah, Jaren asked a question about, I'll have a link. I have a web page where I've curated like links to all the stuff from this project, and we'll share that at the end. Just want to touch on what you can learn if you want to go to the hassle of going and looking at paper cases. And one thing we learned were very detailed outcome information. What percentage go through to an order of eviction? We actually know exactly then how many are returned, meaning there's evidence that a officer of the court has physically visited the premises to confirm the tenant is out or physically remove their belongings. We also learned that on average, it's only about a month and a half's worth of rent, and that distribution is really skewed. I would say, most cases are about 1 month's rent, and there's a small number that are, a few more. So it averages out to 1.5, and the average amount due is $1,000. We also learned that tenants are not represented in these cases. It's less than 10% Washtenaw County. It's less than 5% statewide from the JDW data. But landlords, which are the defendants here, are generally represented at pretty high rates. So I mentioned 2020, a kind of bewildering and ever-changing variety of really historically unprecedented and important policies and programs are rolled out. There's court moratoria, there's rental assistance programs, eviction diversion, and so forth. And so we, the team, continued our work and produced a follow-up report, because the original report didn't anticipate or have much about all of these changes. And so the follow-up report is really mainly a policy report. There's some data there, only aggregate data from the state. And so this report contained this a chart that we created, which overlays some of those different events on statewide caseload data and shows that courts essentially closed, but then there was a resumption of eviction cases, but that was simultaneous with the creation of assistance programs, which tenants could take advantage of, and as well as CDC moratoria affecting some types of housing units. The one interesting development was my sense is that our report actually showed a lot of people the value of this JDW data, and therefore the State Court Administrative Office during the pandemic began and has continued to produce data that they place on their website in a PDF report on at one time it was biweekly. I think now they might be updating it monthly. So this chart I'm showing here is actually directly from a report that they're producing. I think this has been a great development. We really support that, because at a minimum, it supports this kind of longitudinal tracking statewide of what are the trends. And we've had conversations with them, and I'm hopeful that we can perhaps collaborate with them to not only provide this aggregate statewide caseload data, but perhaps find a way of having more geographic specificity and allowing stakeholders to drill into counties and cities from the state data without requiring the reporting and participation of local court officials, which are busy running the machinery of justice to understand local trends. This chart, it has a lot of information. That's good. It's visually a little challenging to guide you through it. You can see that the bars represent different years. The punchline here, if you stare long enough, is that it's a little noisy, but that generally caseloads are returning to pre-pandemic levels. So they're maybe not fully there, but you can see there's been a increase each year, and so that's one thing that we learned. And the link where there's the PDF that it's available to the public is on the slide here, and it's in the footnotes of the second report many places. So it's you can bookmark it and join me in visiting it frequently. Okay, so I just wanted to provide a refresher or a taste of what it is that we did, but really the goal today is to think more prospectively about the future and what we can do. And that's, I think, April has some really great ideas there. Eviction defense was something we were promoting, in our policy work as well, and it's now so exciting to see that it's coming to fruition in Detroit, and we'll learn about that. So what are some things we could do? Well, first, my point here is that there's some development of data infrastructure needed. And so I think that could take two forms. That could be improvements to the reporting already being done by the State Court Administrative Office. It could also be done through innovations really conducted by court officials. So I've learned courts are like administratively part of the different local governments, but kind of like, I guess, financially, in terms of like the buildings they occupy and who pays the salary, but really administratively, they're autonomous of local government, and the court officials and judges have discretion, but how they're run is according to the rules distributed statewide. And so, but we think there could be greater data sharing by the local courts with city governments. So they're often physically in the same building. You kind of walk across the hall. The eviction lab during the pandemic has created this tracking system where they have real-time tracking from many cities and states around the country, but not Michigan. And we think that could change and would be excited to work with anyone in the state, any local court interested in exploring how that could happen technically. Once we get more data from local courts, we could plug into the eviction lab, plug into local information sharing, and make your local data available for policy and research applications. Then shifting to, once greater data infrastructures are developed or data are available, what could we do? And I got this isn't only me, this is from a broader team. We did some brainstorming over email. And so I kind of put these in two big buckets. The first category would be more really kind of operationally in terms of social service delivery or eviction diversion, what you would do with real-time granular information. And it includes tenant outreach, recruitment to assistance programs that might exist, inform right to counsel programs of systematic patterns. For example, LIHTC landlords don't always, due to the HUD rules, actually have certain restrictions on eviction about good cause they may or may not be following or aware of. It also, in terms of program evaluation, to the extent there's eviction diversion or other eviction related policies or programs, the granular data would help you do evaluation. Then, so that's more in my orbit. As the second one would be more from a broader policy and planning perspective. What can you do with it? And we already showed how you can use it to find eviction hotspots, broadly useful in designing policies and programs, doing outreach. You could combine it with other housing data to understand neighborhood markets and conditions from a broader housing policy and planning point of view. And in some places, we did not do it. We didn't get the names of landlords from our request. They create kind of hall of shame lists of the top landlords and eviction rates and code violations and so forth. I will note, we know nationally from a lot of those reports that sometimes different forms of affordable housing or public housing often appear on the list. And so it's, kind of a function of the types of housing the landlords has, as well as their practices and participation in different programs and how they run their businesses. So that's what I wanted to share today. So this is the link that we'll share in the follow-up. It's a little ungainly, but it brings you to a page that has direct links to the different policy reports, to the track map. And then I didn't touch on today, but we did publish a social science research paper looking at the statewide data and looking at a track level what the characteristics of tracts were in how the kind of correlates to eviction differed in urban and rural contexts. And so in rural areas, evictions has a strong relationship with mobile homes and certain other characteristics that are quite different than in urban areas, where it's often related to multifamily housing, economically fragile households, and where they live. And to a certain extent, race, although it's fairly weak due to the other drivers in our models. So that's what I wanted to share. Looking forward to April and the discussion with all of you.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. Next up, we'll hear from April Faith-Slaker. April is the Executive Director of the Detroit Office of Eviction Defense, where she coordinates the implementation of the Right to Counsel Ordinance. Prior to this role, she was the Associate Director of Research Innovations at the Harvard Access to Justice Lab, where she conducted rigorous research on various access to justice topics. She has also held numerous positions with the American Bar Association, all of which involved working to improve program and policies in the civil justice area. April?
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me share my screen. And just as I was about to present, some neighbors started doing something with their lawn, which is very noisy. So hopefully that doesn't interrupt the sound. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the Detroit Right to Counsel program. For the purpose of today's discussion, I'm going to focus on research and evaluation, but there's a lot to say about how the program is structured. So if anyone has questions about that afterwards, I'm happy to talk more about that. So many of you may know that the Right to Counsel ordinance in Detroit was passed last year. I started in this position in January, so this is a very new program. We did get started getting the lawyers in the courtrooms under this program on March 1st. So we've been running this for about a month and a half, and City Council just approved more funding, so we'll be able to expand the program. So given that this is a new program, it's the perfect timing to be thinking about research and evaluation, because of course, if you don't collect the data, you can't analyze it later. So I'm trying to be very proactive about thinking about the research questions that I want to be addressing. So we've covered this a bit, but we do expect that eviction numbers will return to the pre-pandemic era. In Detroit, that hovers around 25 to 30,000 evictions per year. So that is a lot of evictions. I would say we have a pretty significant eviction problem in Detroit. So it does look like we're going to return to something like that in 2023. So you know, things did dip down during the pandemic, but it's looking like we'll have something like 25 to 30,000 evictions in 2023. Just a couple of things about the legislation and what it covers. The program will provide services to individuals who are at 200% of the federal poverty level or below. That's pretty typical for Right to Counsel legislation, so that's not anything unexpected. There is this income cutoff to prioritize resources. And then it does cover more than just evictions cases. So it'll cover things like mortgage foreclosures, property tax foreclosures, et cetera. But again, with that income cap. So all of that is pretty typical of the Right to Counsel legislation across the country. I think what is atypical about our legislation is that there's a lot of very detailed points about the evaluations that should be conducted. That's in my wheelhouse, so I'm excited about that. I'm a bit of a data nerd, so but it was interesting to see that formally put into the ordinance, which is unusual for Right to Counsel ordinances. So a bit about the program structure, because this is relevant to what data I will have access to and what kinds of evaluations I'll be able to do. So the Right to Counsel program, located at the city that I am covering, is not all of the funding that is going towards these kinds of cases. So I'm overseeing ARPA funding that comes to my office. It was $6 million over 3 years, and now that just got increased, so it's $18 million over 3 years. And then there's a separate source of funding from the Gilbert Family Foundation. Now, so I am not able to see the data for the cases that are covered by the Gilbert Family Foundation, although I do hope that in the future there will be some coordination between us. And I've already had some discussions at least about trying to make sure that we're collecting similar data points. So down the road, we can do some evaluation or make some statements about all of our cases together. The good news is that both of these funding streams are going to the same legal service providers for the most part, so that it's kind of all the same providers managing all the services. So there are 4 total in the mix, although Gilbert is only providing to 3 of them, I think. So that helps in terms of similar case management systems. There's a similarity of the case management systems. We can do a lot of work in terms of helping each of the organizations to be collecting the outcome data the same way. Although, as anyone knows who works with field research, you can't really guarantee that individuals will all collect the data the same way. So I definitely know that we'll have some training that we'll have to try to implement to get everyone on the same board about how they're interpreting outcome data that the attorneys are putting into their case management systems to have accurate evaluations. But I wanted to touch on that. There's a lot more to be said about the structure, but this is kind of a critical point to get across when thinking at least about the evaluation aspect of this. So this slide is meant to kind of demonstrate very roughly a couple of points. So 100% would be something like 30,000 evictions per year. And a couple points I want to make about this is that we estimate that about 20% of those will be over income and therefore not serviceable by the Right to Counsel program. So that's what this square in the middle represents. So one important point I want to make is to the left, this rectangle is that we know that there are a significant number of people that do not show up to court and end up with default judgments. And so that's problematic because the current structure, the current way that the Right to Counsel program is functioning provides lawyers at court. And so if someone doesn't show up to court right now, they're not going to be connected up with the Right to Counsel program. And so it's debatable what portion of the whole population that will be, but it's anywhere from 25% to 50% of these cases are default judgments. And it's more like 50% if you look at pre-pandemic numbers. It's more like 25% if you look now. But the point is, that's a lot of people who are not showing up to court. And so one thing that I'll want to be thinking about is what kind of interventions can address this population, and what do we know about this population as well? So that's kind of an empirical question, right? And it's also one that's difficult to answer with at least the data that I have now. And then the remaining folks who do show up to court, more or less will be divided between the Gilbert funding and our funding. One other important point to make about that is also, I think, an important empirical question, not just in the eviction arena, but for civil justice generally, is that some of these people will receive full representation. The Gilbert Foundation has been providing a mix of services. So some people get full representation, other people get lower levels of service, so brief services or advice if it's determined that they don't need full representation. And so that's just to try to focus resources as much as possible to serve as many people as possible. We are likely to be moving towards that model as well in order to try to cover this whole population. But there's definitely more to say about that, how to make that determination about who gets what level of service. Okay, so what do Right to Counsel programs really do in the evictions arena? There are some rigorous studies, one in particular on evictions, what the different levels of service do. And then there's also some research on civil justice in general, answering the question about what do lawyers do in these kinds of cases. And so there's promising research, and then there's also a number, basically every Right to Counsel program that has popped up in the evictions arena has done evaluations. And I would be hesitant about assuming that an evaluation in one jurisdiction would, that those similar results would apply here, but there is a growing consensus among those evaluations that there are some very positive outcomes for tenants in these cases. There's also some growing information that there's benefits to communities more generally, in terms of things like improving housing generally, and savings for the jurisdictions in terms of, all the support systems that are needed when there are high eviction rates. So for this program, I have a number of empirical questions I want to have my eyes on. I think that a lot of these can't really be properly addressed with one evaluation from one program, that some of these are really big questions that need a lot of research and a lot of different methodologies applied to them. But starting with the top one on this page, the really big question, what do right to counsel programs do? And thinking about the different kinds of outcomes that we might look at, not just for tenants, but for communities, for the general housing, housing security in a jurisdiction, and so forth. So that's a big question I don't expect to fully answer with my program, but I will be doing my best to collect as much data as I can on that topic, and not just thinking about what happens to people in terms of the court outcomes, but getting beyond that, the understanding what kinds of data sets are available, so I can answer the questions of what's actually happening to the individuals after the court's disposition. So the second question here, I kind of mentioned before, but what level of legal service is most effective and for whom and in what types of cases? So basically, triaging these kinds of cases. Every legal service provider does this across the country. So this is a common thing that is happening, is triaging who to give self-help materials to, who to give brief services to, who to provide full representation to. And I think that legal service providers really do a great job in terms of using their professional judgment about that. But there's really almost no empirical research on that. And I think that would be a great area to kind of delve into and to understand what is the best way to identify what level of service a person really needs to be successful. And then third question, what are the main barriers to showing up to court, and what kinds of interventions would be most effective? So this is back to that question of default judgments and why that population doesn't show up to court. It's probably not any one reason. It's probably multiple different reasons that apply to different contexts and different people. But what are some of the primary reasons, and are there interventions that we can think about to reach out to that population? I would suspect that the more vulnerable people are in that population as opposed to the ones who are showing up to court. So if we're being responsible about thinking about right to counsel and providing it to the people who need it, getting at understanding the population and doing appropriate effective outreach is important. I could imagine, the people who are less tech savvy maybe have trouble with the Zoom hearings, because all these court hearings are being done on Zoom right now, or have trouble determining when their court date are. And, it's not fair that those people would be so disadvantaged because we're not doing appropriate outreach. So that's another one. Fourth question here, I'm certainly thinking about the ecosystem, right? The housing ecosystem and all the other kinds of social supports that may be available. So an empirical question about what is like the magical combination, not that there would be a silver bullet solution, but not just narrowly thinking about the legal services we're providing, but how does that exist in conjunction with the other services that are available, and what happens when you combine those? And then finally, what is the most effective intervention point for improving housing instability and preventing evictions? Like I said, this particular iteration of the program, and we may, hopefully grow that, but it doesn't. The intervention happens after an eviction filing has taken place, and so while lawyers in the courtrooms may make a big difference at that point, is there something that can be more thoughtfully done upstream, right? So those are the big questions that I want to have my eye on. There's certainly other researchers and other people in this arena who are working on these problems, and I will draw from that research in trying to apply that to the program. But within my program, there is some evaluation that I can do to try to answer some of these questions, or at least have my eyes on some of the trends. So, okay, this slide has a ton of text on it, and I don't expect you to read through it, but what this in the middle is represents, or actually is the right to counsel ordinance list of outcomes that have to be collected. So so that's actually pretty extensive, but what I want to draw your attention to is I've kind of grouped them on the right in terms of like what the categories are. And what you can see is that the categories do really focus on what happens at the end of the court case. So did the person stay in their home? Were they given more time for move out if they had to move out? What happened to the rental arrears? What happened in terms of landlord compliance with certificates of compliance? That's a big problem here in Detroit. And what services were provided. And there isn't, not to be critical, but it is very much focused on the end of the court case. And there isn't much thinking about contemplating what happens afterwards. Or what I would like to think about too is, at least with the data that I'll be able to see if people come back into the system. So I guess you could call that eviction recidivism. And so I'll be able to at least see, try to track that as a longer term thing that gets beyond what the ordinance has asked for. But, are there particular types of individuals or landlords that are causing more evictions, people coming back into the system? Court data, of course, is a big question. So the court data that I'm currently receiving is covers all eviction filings, and so that's great because I can at least see how the portion of individuals that we're serving with the Right to Counsel program, and hopefully also coordinating with the Gilbert funds as well. What are we covering? What are we missing? So we will have those court filings. So I'm getting general court filings and the dispositions as well. The court data is pretty bare bones though. And this is not to be critical of the 36th District Court. This is just court data everywhere. I think a lot of court systems could use an update. So if I were able to get into their system, I would definitely add some more categories to this. But for now, this is what we're able to get from the court. Legal services data is really great. So I've gotten some sample data already from UCHC, which is the organization I'm working with currently that has been in the courtrooms already. And so there's a lot of detail about defendants themselves. So I do have zip code information. I have full address information, actually, demographics, information about the household size and income sources. So really good information. Again, I'll have that for my cases, and there's potential to coordinate with Gilbert. They will also have that level of detail. There's also great information about the housing conditions. So what kind of repair issues are needed, and so forth. What services were provided by the legal services organizations, and then case outcomes from the legal service providers are much more detailed than what the court provides. So there's something like 80 different outcome codes that the attorneys can select from, and they select more than one. So it might be like, one outcome that specifically speaks to what happened with their finances, and then something that happened with repairs, something that happened with move out. So it's really good information. I'm almost out of time, but I want to be thinking about other data sets that may be really helpful in terms of like that thing I said about getting beyond what happened in the courtroom. And so I have some thoughts that I listed here. When it comes to data that is housed at the city, so like in the building and safety department or housing services, that will be fairly easy for me to get that data. Data that's existing in other data sets would in some cases require that the tenants sign some kind of consent form authorizing the release of that information. So that's certainly not impossible, but it is another barrier to getting that kind of data. And then, like I said, within my data set, I think the best, and I'm open to other people's ideas, but the best long-term data that I can collect is actually just kind of looking at who's returned into the system, whether that's returned into our Right to Counsel program, returned in via the Gilbert cases, or if I can see them in the court case filings, which right now I'm receiving just names and not dates of birth. So someone with a common name, it's hard to track if they've come back into the system. And I think that's about time, but I'm looking forward to the 15-minute Q&A session we have now. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, April, and thanks so much, Rob. Those presentations were both wonderful. And I myself have tons of questions for you all. But please, everyone out there, please take a second to submit some questions and answers. We'd love to hear what the questions that are on your mind. But I'll get started with a question for April. I think that the questions you raised are spot on and really interesting, but I'm wondering, getting a brand new right to counsel program off the ground is a huge undertaking in and of itself. So, what funding and capacity do you individually or the program have to do this type of internal evaluation or to partner with others?
Yeah, so I think part of why I was hired for this position is because of my research background. So, unfortunately, there isn't funding within the city ARPA funds for evaluation. So that's kind of my time will be spent on that. But I know that the Gilbert Foundation has allocated a significant amount of money towards evaluation. And so I'm very interested to see what their evaluation will look like and want to coordinate with them as soon as possible. We have had conversations about that. To understand what their evaluator is going to look like, whether I can implement some of what they're doing, whether they can implement some of what I'm doing. Really want to get on the same page about that. And I'm certainly very interested in collaborating with them on that, or any other researchers, honestly. So just throwing that out there.
Great, thank you. Rob, there's a question for you, which is you mentioned evictions are closely tied to other housing factors such as housing quality. And you mentioned the importance of combining data on these topics and the potential to do that. Where should researchers be looking for these other sources of housing data, especially in Michigan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a couple things come to mind. Well, one, in our work, the one product where we're combining eviction data with a lot of other sources is the research paper, which is available, and so that might be of interest. I mean, for kind of basic information, the census and the American Community Survey are sources, but the challenges with those is there's fairly large margins of error when you drill down to the neighborhood like tract levels, and then two other sources come to mind. The HUD and the U.S. Postal Service have an interesting data set about the Postal Service has their own giant database of every mailbox in the country. And so when a property becomes vacant, they know it because they don't want to deliver the junk mail to it. And so the HUD has a long running partnership to use that to create like longitudinal data about vacancy trends. It's much fresher than what the census can give you. Census will have a vacancy stat, but it's an estimate, and it's for a 5-year period at the local level. And so that's a data set. But then, of course, you mentioned quality, and that's always a moving target. And so it's up, that's for that reason, communities have done surveys of housing conditions. That's very typical if there's a community trying to plan for that, to like actually do a survey, because it's always a moving target, and there's different systematic ways to collect that information, either just based on exterior kind of driving through neighborhoods, or in a more granular way. But I'm not aware of it's done as needed. So yeah, that'll be a few things that come to mind.
Thanks, Rob. April, there's a question for you about to what extent you are planning to engage community organizations and activists around your evaluation process.
Yeah, I was just typing out a response, but yeah, I'm super open to that. I have, only been in the job since January, but I have started meeting with various identified organizations and folks in the space. I know that there were a lot of people who were involved in getting the ordinance passed in the first place, and I definitely want to be coordinating and communicating with all of them. Have started doing some of that work, but if there's anyone who I should be meeting with who I haven't yet, please let me know and do an introduction email, and I definitely want to be doing more of that.
Thanks, April. Rob, I have a question for you. I noticed on one of April's slides that the court looked like the court data wasn't going to include the addresses of the case filings, just the party names. And I wondered, Rob, if you could talk, as someone who does mapping and GIS, about the importance of the value of getting the addresses of these filings and what that would allow cities and researchers to explore. At the same time, maybe you could talk about potential ways to address potential privacy concerns. Obviously, folks facing eviction don't need one more thing like their address out there being shared as they're going through this. So,
yeah, and so that's right. The geographic information, so in order to create the track level maps, we geocoded addresses. And so we negotiated a data sharing agreement and obtained IRB approval. And also it followed the JDW's procedure. And, that's, and so, yeah, so I think that for like April, for like, within like that city sharing, I think it can be managed, and there are models of person identifiable information being shared with particularly around like school data or health data for evaluation purposes, with safeguards put in place, and thinking through what amount of sharing is ethically appropriate, and when do you actually want to ask permission, just from an ethical standpoint. Not outside of the university, IRB doesn't exist, so you have to proactively create your privacy law. Aside from health and educational records, there is no federal or we don't have a privacy law like Europe. So those are just a few thoughts on that. And so, yeah, you could ask them for that. But I think it could be even like a little more nuanced. Like, for example, perhaps they don't want to reveal addresses, but they could assign the cases to neighborhoods or something like that, and then aggregate it based on neighborhoods. So there are ways of maybe giving you geographic detail without providing addresses. If I may, I want to address one other question about the nature of the project. How do you engage with or plan to engage with communities of interest in your research? And so, yeah, our project was actually the funding mechanism. The Detroit Urban Research Center was part of it, and it was a collaborative project, but it was between researchers and the legal aid community. And so, and we did reflect on, we did stakeholder engagement in Washtenaw County and also through statewide legal aid institutions and meetings to advise what we're doing. So it wasn't purely research, as in I didn't determine it. It was done collaboratively, but we decided that it would not be a community-based participatory research project. And it really is in the mode of kind of liberal advocacy, putting up numbers and maps, kind of broadly sketching it out. And I do feel that work should be complemented by community-based or participatory research. I know Alexa Eisenberg's work in Detroit is has been more engaged, and it should be, given the context and to complement what we're doing. So yeah, I engage in different forms of research, and this one did engage in a particular way. Maybe we did it right, maybe we did it wrong, but I'm just acknowledging we did reflect on that and had a kind of philosophy about what it is this project would do and how it could be complemented by other kinds of work. So that's my thought about that.
Thanks, Rob. So this will be the last question. April, I was wondering if you could talk about your current plans to coordinate with other programs, organizations, or city departments. And I think there's a particular interest in, is there a way that the Right to Counsel program could be used to partner with, forget the name in Detroit, the building division that's working on conditions and certificates of compliance to improve housing conditions, as if you don't have enough already to do.
No, that actually is a very relevant question. We're working right now on hiring attorneys that will be housed within the Building and Safety Department to intervene on right to counsel cases, to request that the judges order compliance for the landlords. So we're going to try that approach. I'm not sure that Right to Counsel is really the best place for that solution, but that is one thing we can at least try. I would hope that the court would be more proactive in enforcing these issues, but that's where we are. So we'll try that approach.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Well, so I'm here now. I would like to thank our speakers today for this wonderful session and thank the viewers for joining us today. Today does mark our final event for the winter 2023 of the Housing Solutions Speaker Series, and we're so happy to have been able to highlight the variety of housing research and practice and their connections to health and health equity throughout these events. We are so grateful to our partners who have helped us promote this event series, especially Poverty Solutions and the School of Public Health. If you have not yet done so, please keep in touch with us by signing up for our newsletter and to continue to look out for more events and research from us starting in the fall. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again to Libby for moderating, Rob for your wonderful input on data, and April for that city perspective. So we're really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Great, thanks.